Hey y'all, my name is Priscilla and welcome back to my channel Bookie Charm. For today's video, I am going to be talking through all of my reading stats for the year 2020. So 2020 was the third year that I tracked my reading. I think that it's a really great thing to do, a really great experience, because I am able to reflect on my reading with hard data over years, and it also helps me set intentions for the following year of how I want my reading to go. So that's why I do it. Now, why I track my reading in 3 different ways. There's a reason for that too. I don't recommend it, but I do it. I track my reading in Goodreads and now in Storygraph, which I am kind of slowly transitioning to, and my own personal reading spreadsheet, which I get directly from Sophie over at Portal in the Pages. So all that to say that I'm going to be pulling data from like 3 different places. So first of all, let's take a high level look at my reading over the year. Very brief overview. I read about 29,000 pages and I read about 120 books. And again, this is a variation. This is an average because Goodreads says I read 122 books. And I don't know where those extra 2 books came from, and I didn't feel like looking through and finding the culprit here, but about 120 books, which is very good, and that includes everything from long high fantasies that are over 500 pages to a number of short picture books that are less than 30 pages. The shortest book that I read this year is a picture book at 28 pages called Abuelita, Full of Life, and the longest book that I read this year was The Dragon Republic, which is the sequel to the Poppy War by R.F. Kuang at 658 pages. To me, it's kind of interesting that the shortest book is also from an independent press and backlist, and The Dragon Republic is neither of those things. And in terms of the most popular, according to Goodreads, I read Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen with over 4 million people who have it shelved. And the least popular, again, was Abuelita, Full of Life, vida, which is a picture book that's only been shelved by 75 people. And the highest rated book that I read on Goodreads was Sana Sana by Ariana Brown, and I am mentioning this because it's what she deserves. And according to Storygraph, I read books that are mostly fiction and that center on themes that are emotional, reflective, and adventurous, which I think is the first time I've encountered those words to describe my reading, and I have to agree. I read a lot of very, very deeply emotional books, memoirs, and poetry. And I read a lot of reflective things in nonfiction as well as my fantasy and sci-fi. The adventurous books, I think obviously a lot of the speculative SFF books that I read are adventurous, along with middle grade and picture books. So yeah, that I think is a great way to describe my reading. And I typically choose medium-paced books that are less than 300 pages. I think that estimate, less than 300 pages, is pretty accurate across all platforms, because I think any year where I read 10 plus, 20 plus even poetry books and picture books, that average is always going to be less than 300 pages. And across all platforms, my average rating for 2020 was 3.9 stars, which I am very proud of, because in the past, according to the Storygraph, which has a lifetime view of star ratings as it has been imported from Goodreads, my lifetime star rating has been on the average of 3.76, and I've been trying to make it a goal to be more comfortable with rating things 5 stars. I do consider myself to be a critical reader. It can be easy to like knock off stars, but I don't think that's always necessarily think it's fair to especially authors of color and queer authors that already have to face racist reviewers and homophobic reviewers too. So yeah, that's an accomplishment of mine. I've been able to pick up more books that I think are suited to me, that I'm going to enjoy, and that I'm going to rate 5 stars now. So in terms of star rating, from the Storygraph, I have 22 books that were rated either 4.5 stars to 5 stars, which I think I'm going to be using half stars more and more, because I love that Storygraph does it, and I want to start doing that on my personal spreadsheet as well. But yeah, that's a good amount of 5 stars for me, 4.5 to 5 stars, and I'm really proud of that. I do rate a lot of things, either 4 stars or 3.5 stars, a total of 68 books. I tend to DNF a lot, so that's why those 2 and 2.5 stars are so low. I did also want to note here that the 2 stars that I rated this past year went to books that had absolutely no diversity. And I do track diversity in my reading. I'm not thrilled with how I do it, but I will show you, detail that later on in this video. But the books that I read and rated 2 stars were Northanger, Abbey, Tunnel of Bones, Ministry of Truth, and A Woman of No Importance. A Woman of No Importance does include a disabled character, but the author I don't think is disabled. Is something of note here that I noticed, so whatever that means. Then let's talk about page length and the kinds of books that I picked up. I pick up a lot of books, again, less than 100 pages. Those 33 are most likely picture books. 199, that page range is probably the poetry books that I read. They tend to be less than 200 pages. And then my sweet spot in reading is 200 to 400 pages. I think that most new releases, most contemporary books are about this length, so that's not surprising to me. That's a lot of what I read. I do not pick a lot of books that are over 500 pages, certainly not more than 600 pages. And those books from the 500 to 700 page range are very memorable books. So I think I want to think about that a little more. Maybe I should start picking up larger books, although they tend to intimidate me. These are, again, high fantasy books mostly. They're usually fantasy series, so they do take a commitment. And I think that that, along with the length, and I don't consider myself a fast reader, so it takes a significant effort to pick up those books, and that's why they intimidate me. But they also are some very memorable books. Books like the Greenbone Saga series, as well as the Poppy War series, were books that I read in this page range and that are highlights of my year for sure. In terms of pages per month, it looks like I peaked in May, which, okay, cool. And then in March, I had over 3,000 pages as well as in July. March was my birthday month, so maybe I was reading a lot then. It's also when the pandemic kind of broke out and a lot of closures were happening, so that may have been what I was doing then. My lowest reading months were December, which is not surprising to me because December tends to be very stressful in terms of like holidays and just the stress of end of year stuff. In terms of books per month, I was reading the most books in September, which is Latinx Heritage Month, Latinx-a-thon, Latinx Book Bingo, all those Latinx-led events. That was probably where that peak came from. And then I read 12 books in March, May, and November. So March again was my highest page count, so that's not surprising. But November was Nonfiction November and in Digithon, so maybe readathons tend to push that book count up a little bit. And then my years published, books that I picked up from years published. I am a contemporary reader because most of the books I read were published from 2016 onward. But I did read a couple of books from the 2000s, and I read one book from the 80s. I think that was an Octavia Butler book. I read Wild Seed, and 2 books from the 1800s. So those were classics, the Jane Austen books that I read. The next graph from my personal spreadsheet I want to show you is my age ranges. I tend to read mostly adult, with 63% being adult titles, followed by YA, middle grade, and children's. I'm actually surprised to see this because I kind of consider myself more of a middle grade children's reader than a YA reader, but I read quite a bit of YA, particularly YA fantasies. In terms of the format I read my books in, I read mostly hardbacks, but 34%, which I'm not surprised by because I utilized my library a whole hell of a lot this past year. Discovered this system of putting things on hold, and with the pandemic, my library is wonderful, and they had a curbside assistance pretty much throughout from March to the end of the year. And that's been really great. So that's where I got most of my hardbacks and paperbacks from. I also read an 18% ebooks. I'm not surprised at how low this is. I'm actually surprised at how high this is because ebooks and me did not get along this year. Although I have Hoopla now and my library bumped up your loan amount per month in 2020, I still didn't like having that digital screen on because I was staring at screens so much working from home. So that is not surprising to me. I'm actually surprised at how high it is. And for audiobooks, I read 33% audiobooks, again, because I was working from home so much. I wasn't listening to audiobooks on commutes anymore. But yeah, mostly hardbacks. Now, in terms of genre, this is wild, y'all. This is when it really starts getting inaccurate because it is so difficult to place books in one genre, especially those books that are multiple genres, that are genre bending. So from my personal spreadsheet, I read 28% fantasy, and I read 8% essays, 9% contemporaries, and 8% romances, 14% picture books. So those are my major genres, subgenres. The one thing that was surprising actually was essays. I never thought of myself as a nonfiction essay reader. I read so many different genres, and I kind of feel that imposter syndrome when I say I'm a fantasy reader, because that's not the majority of what I read, but it is a good chunk of what I read. So should I be feeling that imposter syndrome? Probably not. But yeah, I'm never going to be pinned down to one genre. Let's just leave it at that. And here's a graph from the story graph that shows you how much fiction I read in comparison to my nonfiction. I do like to read a lot of nonfiction, but fiction is always going to be the majority of my reading. But I'm pretty happy with this overall. I would like to do something similar to this moving forward in 2021. Let's go back to my spreadsheet, and I mostly started tracking my reading from my personal spreadsheet because other platforms like Goodreads and Storygraph don't tell me enough about the author, and I wanted to make sure that I was reading from more broader audiences. And this year I read the majority female, 67%, followed by male at 27%, and I read 6% non-binary authors, which is up from the following years, but still not great. So I definitely want to make sure that I'm at least reading a little bit more non-binary authors in 2021. I also track author nationality, which is always like one of my most embarrassing graphs out here, because I read 76%, I think is what that says, from the US, followed by others, the UK, Puerto Rico, Trinidad and Tobago, Nigeria, multiples, those are usually anthologies or short story collections, Mexico, Japan, Canada, and Brazil. And this is, I think, an area that I've said before I want to do better at, but I find it difficult. I really do. And it's not an excuse, but it is something that I am cognizant of. And I know I need to, like, Oceania is not even represented here. I read no books from Australia or New Zealand, and that's something that I've also said in the past. So that's a goal that I want to make in 2021, is to either read at least one book from Oceania. Would be nice, so the whole world is represented in this graph. This is going to be a process definitely to make this a little bit less embarrassing for me. In terms of author race, this is another very dicey situation. I just felt like I started critiquing author photos and like stalking authors and trying to make that determination on my own felt really strange to me. So I ended up just placing, because I read a large number of Latinx authors, in POC. That's how I do it. And I read mostly POC at 76%, and I read 24% white authors. So I'm happy with these numbers. Ideally, I think I'd want to be like an 80-20 split, POC white. But overall, this has been like the driving force in my reading in the past few years. So that's something that I think I do more naturally now. It's taken me 3 years, but that's something that I definitely am a lot more prone to do without even having that much effort in it anymore. So I think that goal has served its purpose, and I don't think I'm going to be taking that goal into 2021 because I just do it naturally now. Again, I'm not leaving this goal behind. It's not like I'm not going to be doing this anymore, but definitely something that I'm going to continue doing but build upon. So I also track the book source, whether I own this book or I've rented or borrowed this book. And the majority of the books that I read, 75% I borrowed. That is either from the library, mostly from the library, from Libby. Also, I used Hoopla this year. I had an Audible Prime, an Amazon, what the fuck is that called? Prime Reading. I had that monthly thing. I canceled that shit because Amazon sucks. But I did have that for a while. I counted those as borrowed, a monthly subscription thing. Most of my reading is always going to be borrowed because I consider myself to be a book curator versus a collector. I think that I will always try to limit how many books I buy because I just want to read so many things, but not necessarily own so many things. I'd prefer to have books from my shelves that I really, really love. So that's where I sit there. I also track publishers. I've tracked the big five, Penguin Random House, Hachette, Macmillan, Simon & Schuster, HarperCollins, and other is indies or self-published. And the majority I read are from Penguin Random House. I'm kind of happy with 34%. I think that that is a significant chunk, and I'm actually pretty proud of that. Oh yes, my most popular publisher was definitely Penguin Random House, but I also like to track like popular authors, books that I read a lot from the same author. My most popular author was Jean Ling Yang, who is the author of the Avatar: The Last Airbender graphic novel series. I read 5 of those this year, so that was my most popular author of 2020. And honestly, 2020 was kind of the year of Avatar: The Last Airbender for me anyway, because I started reading the graphic novels. I rewatched the series on Netflix when it started streaming, as well as rewatched Korra. I read the Kyoshi novels in 2020, so it was the year of Avatar, I guess, for me. In terms of like publishers and imprints that I read the most that I read from was Tor. I read a number of short novellas like Ring Shot, Riot Baby, The Ballad of Black Tom, Come Tumbling Down. Another thing that I track that I almost forgot about because I didn't put it in my notes here is queer authors. I do track queer authors, so I'll include that chart here. And I really liked how Books and Lala, obviously everyone loves Books and Lala stats videos, but I really liked how she like examined some of the book covers and trends that she saw with them. Most of the books that I read feature red as the prominent color. That's the color that stood out to me most. And these books are very emotional books that make sense with my reading moods. I read a lot of books that have like a portrait of a person, and I think that these show my reflective mood in picking up books. 16 books had blue covers and or landscapes, and a lot of books that I read, especially my nonfiction books, have like a bold faced font with like a plainer background, and I think that this is a representative of those essay collections that maybe feature a number of themes or like as a mission statement for a broad range of essays in a book. And also those books, some books have like this text with like a very bright colored background or texture to them, and I think that this is representative of books that have a lot of POVs and maybe perspectives and stories. That's just, I mean, what does this tell us at all, if anything? Not much, but that's trends that I noticed in book covers. My camera is dying. Let's end this video very, very quickly. But those are my stats for the year 2020. I hope that you found this interesting. I hope that you maybe understand me more as a reader. I'd be interested if you had any thoughts, if you track similar things to me, or you have any suggestions. If you have those sorts of suggestions for how you have improved your inaccurate stats from the year before, I would like to hear them. Outside of that, that's all I have for this stats review and year in review reading.